Hey, how you guys doing? Welcome, Metanoia Catholic Training. We're going to be doing these a little bit more. This is the first one that we're doing, a monthly training, free training for y'all. And we're going to focus on decision making. How many of you out there want to be better at making decisions, even the small ones? Oftentimes, the big decisions get all the focus in our lives, but when we think about it, our lives are made up of a lot of little daily decisions. And those daily decisions have an impact on our lives. And when we can start to kind of put together a plan, a formula for making better decisions, even in those smaller decisions, it's almost like getting practice at making those bigger decisions in these little tiny decisions that we're making every single day. So the goal here with the training is to give you a bit of a structure, a way to make some decisions a little bit better so that you can feel more confident about the decisions that you're making, and confident specifically that they are aligned with the will of God. So often that's a question that we get at Metanoia Catholic. How do I know the difference between my will and God's will? And I think a lot of the time we can often be tempted to think that God is not constantly communicating his will to us. But the reality of it is that he is. This is a God as became man. He doesn't communicate to us in these supernatural ways. He communicates to us in these really human ways. So I want to talk about some of those human ways that he communicates to us. I'm going to talk about 5 specifically. And when we can start to better understand and kind of evaluate these 5 ways that God, very human ways that God communicates to us, it's going to make us more confident to make bold decisions in the moment and be able to better recognize what path is really aligned with God's will for your life. So we are live here. If you have any questions, go ahead and chat them into the live chat box. I'll be able to field those towards the end, or just chat in and say hello. Okay. All right. So the first thing I want to dive into is give that first very human communication of God's will for us, and that is something called the universal call to holiness. All right. As Christians, we are all subject to this universal call to holiness, call to be holy. Now, what does that mean, right? Well, we can certainly look to the virtues. The virtues are a way of becoming holy, set apart. And when we grow in those virtues, even on a very natural sense to grow in the virtues, say like patience, for example, it puts us in a disposition where God sees even an image of himself showing up in us, and he can pour more of his life into us. The goal here with these decisions, folks, is to experience a lot more happiness. Yeah, the Christian life is about experiencing happiness. That's what beatitude means, supreme happiness. Well, how do we experience more of that happiness, more of that beatitude, even as much as we can, that imperfect beatitude, as St. Thomas Aquinas says, on this side of heaven? We dispose ourselves as much as possible to receiving more of God's grace. When we receive more of God's grace, it's a sharing God's very life. We can echo those words that St. Paul says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And we have more of God's grace moving in us. That's where we start to live life more on a supernatural plane, so to speak. And we can really be modern day saints. And goodness gracious, our world needs some modern day saints here. Okay, so that first thing is considering that universal call to holiness. And so if you have a particular question or decision that's in front of you, perhaps a question to ask is, okay, how is this going to allow me to live more, respond greater to this universal call in holiness? And we might look at that and where's a virtue that I may grow in this capacity? Another thing I like to consider here of growing in holiness is also growing in faith, right? Faith always has a little bit of uncertainty that's accompanied with it, and oftentimes we can get stuck in indecision when we're waiting for there to be no uncertainty anymore. But oftentimes when God is calling us forward into a new season of life or a new way of living or a new decision, perhaps there's going to be uncertainty involved in there, and we can rejoice in that, because where there is uncertainty, there's always an opportunity to have faith, right? Place our faith in the Lord at that point versus place our faith in what we can see. Walk by sight or walk by faith rather than by sight. So that might be another question you ask as to evaluate whether or not this decision is going to help you respond more fully to this universal call to holiness. Is this requiring me to step out in faith? Now, mind you, I'm not saying like jump off the cliff and learn how to fly on the way down. The way that God I found in my life and the life of my clients also is when he calls us to step out in faith, it's often very gentle, right? Not a drastic one, but just a little bit at a time, okay? There's something, it's not rushing, it's not moving, but it's just a very gentle coaxing out to a life of faith. The other thing I want in this universal call to holiness, part of living that out is entering into the Great Commission as well. So when we have a decision in front of us, maybe we look and say, okay, what would the fruits be if I say yes to this particular system? Is this going to be an opportunity for me to share the gospel a little bit more? Are the fruits going to be sharing the gospel a little bit more? Is it going to be joining me a little bit more to a relationship with our Lord? And therefore, I have this desire to share that relationship with more people? Or is it going to be one where I kind of enter into a little bit more hiding, okay? So a couple things to consider there in whether or not this decision is going to help you grow in this universal call to holiness. One, is it giving you an opportunity to grow in the virtues? Two, is it inviting you in a very gentle way to step out in faith, even if there's a little bit of uncertainty that's in front of you? God often does that. So he certainly wants to learn how to rely on him more. And three, is it giving me the opportunity to spread the gospel more, right? Or the fruits in my life are I'm actually, when I say yes to this, it's something that is efficacious, starts spreading the gospel a little bit more. Okay. So that's the first thing, that universal call to holiness. The second thing is what I call the VSS, okay? Is it something that is helping me to live more excellently in my VSS? Now, what's that VSS? It's your vocation, your state in life, and your season of life. So when I say vocation, I'm talking specifically here with the Christian vocations. We have 3 Christian vocations. Those Christian vocations are married life, the celibate priesthood life, or the religious life, or the single life. Now, mind you, when I say single life, I'm talking more consecrated single life, consecrated virgins, people like that, people that have made a lifelong commitment to the single life, not people that are just discerning. That's more of a season of life. Get to that in a moment. Okay, the beautiful thing about these vocations are there are guidelines, vows that we take that give us some guidance on how to live excellently in those vocations. When we live excellently in those vocations, we will grow virtuously in those vocations, and it will open us to receive more of God's grace. Again, that's the goal here, to receive more of God's grace. And so, say, for example, we look at the married vocation. My father's a deacon. He kind of called me out the other day when I didn't know the marriage vows, and I was citing him over on a podcast, but just calling attention to one of these things, that is the items of consent that a husband and wife will speak to one another on the altar, or they'll say, I do, at the altar before they get into the vows that most of us are familiar with. And this is I love this one. Will you accept children lovingly from God and bring them up according to the law of Christ and his church? All right, so we know that by looking at that vow, one of the tenets, one of the things that is entailed with living excellently in the married vocation is to be open to life, to be open not just to just kind of on a volunteer level, but specifically in the ordinary sense of actually rearing children, right? And not just rearing children, having babies, but growing them up in the faith, right? And so we can look at this and say that when we are conforming ourselves to this vow, it is going to form more of the virtues in us. And if anybody has kids, I certainly have one child. She's going to be 4. There is many opportunities to be formed in the apostolate of those children, as Marie Montessori would talk about, being formed by the apostolate of the child. But at the same time, I can resist this as a parent, and I can resist this calling to have children. Well, the fruits of that are not going to be the virtues in this. The fruits of being unfaithful to the vows of our vocation are not going to bear excellence in our life. In fact, it bears more vice in our life. It's the opposite. It actually closes us off to God's virtue. And it may seem like something that can serve us here and now, but the reality of it is that closing ourselves off to the very source of life will never bear good fruits and lead to happiness in our lives. So consult whatever your vocation is, and perhaps you're still discerning, but if you have chosen a vocation, be sure to revisit those vows regularly and kind of enter into what they really mean. There's a depth to them that I think is very important to consider. Okay, not just a one and done thing at the altar on your wedding day. The next thing, the state in life. And so when I think state in life, I think of the position, specifically a position that you are entering into or a position that you are called into. Okay. So positions might be, say, I'm a father, or I'm a mother, or I have this job at this company. Things like that. When we start to identify what those positions are and we choose those positions, enter into those positions, they come with them. What comes with them are some requirements, almost like a little manual, on what living excellently in those positions looks like. Certainly, from a job description standpoint, we have the your job description. And that job description, what does it do? It says, these are the things that you need to do in order to live excellently in this job. Or if you have a performance review in that position, your boss is telling you what those things are that you need to do to live excellently in that position. And when we can start to live excellently and choose to conform ourselves to the excellent life in that state in life, again, when we choose to live excellently in these states in our life, they have a way of forming us, right, in the process and growing specifically the virtues in us. The virtue is just really means excellence, excellent living in a particular area. I think also of being, a father. I'm a dad. I mentioned that before. So I can even kind of look back even to my vows in some cases and then say, okay, now I'm a father. Are there anything in my vows in my Christian vocation that say that what excellency looks like in that state of life of being a father to a young child? Well, I just read it to you here. We got to bring them up according to the law of Christ and his church. So, what does that mean? That means in order for me to be an excellent father, I am bringing my child up in the laws of Christ and his church. Well, what does that mean? That means I need to be a student of the laws of Christ and his church. I can't just be done with catechism once I got my confirmation. I have to continue to dive into the word and dive into opportunities to grow in my understanding of what the faith is, who God is, and as revealed through the church and what she teaches in the law that's carried on in the church. Okay, so we can kind of consult what our state in life is, and even deciding what excellent living looks like here and now in some of the small decisions. One that comes up, I think, quite often is, especially in a time where we have a lot of content that's available to us, and we can always just jump on YouTube, jump onto our news apps, and we can keep up with what's going on in the world. You can see sometimes where people arguably are investing their time in growing knowledge that's not necessarily pertinent to living excellently in their state in life. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, we might find it very entertaining to open up our news apps and see what's going on in the headlines, or turn on the news and have it on in the background constantly throughout the day, or be indulging in a lot of different podcasts and political podcasts. But when we consult our state in life and our position in life, maybe the living excellently isn't necessarily growing in the knowledge of those areas. Maybe there's knowledge and skills that we need to invest our time in growing that are going to allow us to be better at our job. And when we invest in growing something that arguably is where a politician, somebody that has given their life, that has chosen a state in life that requires that level of knowledge in them and that level of awareness in them to be excellent in that role, in some ways, we're almost being disobedient to our state in life. We're not allowing our state in life, our chosen state in life, to really shape us the way that it has the ability to do, to form those excellent virtues in us. So that's something that could even be a consideration as, do I open this text message or this YouTube link from my friend or not, and give the next 5 minutes of my life investing in this? Is this going to help me grow more excellent in my state in life, or is it going to be an opportunity cost that takes me away from it? All right, the next thing I want to talk about here is excellence in your season of life. We just recorded a podcast, actually, and we were talking to a friend of ours, Beth, that's in our academy, and she's also in our Purgative Way coaching program. And she's a single woman. She started to talk about how there was a time where she was resisting this single season of her life, and I get it. I mean, I remember before I met Aaron, there was just this longing to be beyond this season of my life, and this thought that I wanted to be in my vocation, my God-given vocation, and be at that season. Well, I don't necessarily dictate the timeline of that particular season. God is in control of that. And I can understand even the desire, like the desire to be in that vocation. Yes, there's something greater or objectively greater about being in that season. But the opportunity for grace is in the season that we're in right now. And so when we can start to consider and be conscious of what season of life are we in, maybe some of those seasons have been chosen for us. There's a lot of people that are single right now that don't want to be single, but that's a season that they're in. There's a lot of people that are ill right now or sick, and they don't want to be in that season, but it's a season that they're in. Or maybe they're in the season of life with young kids, and they kind of wish they could just have more conversations or talking to their kids when they're beyond the age of reason, right? And having a little bit more of an interesting dialogue with their kids. But it's not the season that they're in right now. When we can start to acknowledge the seasons that we're in, especially those that we haven't chosen, but they've been given to us in that moment, we can start being available to the opportunities for grace that season offers us. And this is where our conversation with Beth actually led. And it was very exciting to see that when she started to move from resisting the season of singlehood to embracing it and being more open to it, and starting to think not as this is something that she needs to run from, but this is also a season that offers her more opportunities that arguably she loses when she starts to enter into her, a season of dating or her married vocation. Right? There's opportunities for travel that was there. There's opportunities to create her schedule and own her schedule a little bit more, to take some courses, invest in some courses, growing herself personally without it pulling away from any requirements or obligations she has to, say, a spouse in marriage. And as she started to say yes to more of those things, she started to also recognize how this new season of her life was something that was shaping her. And the beautiful part of it, when we say yes to our season of life now, we make decisions that allow us to experience more fully the grace, the opportunities for grace in this present season of life. It actually forms us to be able to say yes, to be open to receive the gift of the next season of our life. It actually elevates us, so to speak. That's what grace does. And again, the goal here with making better decisions is getting a greater disposition to grace so that we might receive more of that grace. God always just is the one that decides when he infuses that grace in us, and we have to be in the state of grace here to receive that grace. All right, folks, so get the confession if you need to. But that is, like, our part is putting ourselves in that disposition and being open to it and being that Marian posture of receptivity. Okay, so that's the second thing, that VSS, being open to and considerate of what living excellently in your vocation, your state in life, and your season of life looks like. The third thing that I'd like you to consider, and this is accessible knowledge to us here and now, is our God-given charism, okay? So you might have heard charisms also referred to as the spiritual gifts. And St. Paul talks about this in different parts of the epistles. And it's things like tongues or prophecy or administration or leadership. And there's some great charisms tests that are out there that can help us to kind of go through those magazine tests, the ones where you answer 144 questions, something like that, and it spits out some areas for you to discern a possible charism in that. Well, what are the charisms? The charisms are gifts that God give to us that when we live in them, they're a great service to the church. They actually have an efficacy. They accomplish the work that God set out in them, right? They're things that actually, when we live in our charisms, they have an effectiveness of building up the church. And think about that. Think of the charisms as this. It is a particular way that God has ordained his grace to manifest in you. Again, think about that. A particular way, a unique way that God's grace will manifest in you. And it has an efficacy that when we say yes to those charisms, it has an effectiveness. It builds up the church. It accomplishes the mission that God has sent that grace out to accomplish, which is amazing. And at that point, I find that when we're living in our charisms, that's where we can very sincerely be those people that say AMDG, to God be the glory, because we recognize that there is something supernatural that is happening. Say, for example, I know I have a charism of leadership. And when we first launched Virtual Catholic Conference and it went viral and 64,000 people registered for this thing, and it happened over the course of 4 weeks, this was something that was so dumbfounding to me that I knew that this was not something that Matt Ingold did. This was Matt Ingold and my team and our business partners as well. This was a collective effort of people stepping into their charisms, and we had all of our speakers that were stepping into their charisms here as well. These prophets and these teachers stepping into their charisms. And this huge, massive grace funnel was moving into this event such that it had great effectiveness. This amazing, huge, like 64,000 people registered for this. It was just mind-boggling. And it happened in a way that I never could have fathomed it happening. Well, what is this? This is very clearly God's grace working in our lives, in a collection of people's lives. And when we can start to step into our charisms, but also unite our charisms to other people's, and so they become complementary, that's where you have now this spousal union of charisms. So how might we discern our charisms? I think one of the great ways of doing it right now, there's a lot of different charism tests that you can take online. I know we're working on building one ourselves at Metanoia Catholic. We've gone to the St. Catherine of Siena Institute. Sherry Waddell put a great charisms workbook together. Maybe some of you have looked into that. But that's a way of kind of discerning a little bit, not living in this place of, oh, God, I don't know what the gifts are that you've given me. But no, knowing that God has given you and acting in faith to go and discover some of these things. And then once you take that little test, like stepping into, like creating some opportunities to live in those God-given charisms. Okay. So that's something to consider here as well. What are my charisms? And then when we have decisions in front of you, I want you to consult those charisms because God wants you to choose to live in what I am starting to call here the zone of grace, okay? Stepping into that zone of grace. When we step into our God-given charism, that is where God has put the outlines and said that, like, your name. This is where I said that when you operate in this capacity, my grace will be effective in you. This is the mission I have sent you on. And he's faithful to that gift, to that calling that he sent you on. And so we can step into it with confidence, confide, with faith at that. So where's a decision in your life giving you an opportunity to grow in your charisms? Or where is it saying, like, you know what, this isn't really, it's asking me to step into a charism that is not really mine. Say you're not somebody that has a charism of hospitality. Well, maybe when somebody approaches you and says, like, hey, we would like you to be a greeter at church, arguably, that's not really what your charism is. And if you say yes to that, then maybe they're going to say, okay, we're done with finding a volunteer to fill the spot. But the next person they might have asked might have had that charism, right? And so we learn to say no to these things when we start to understand more clearly who we are and where God has ordained grace to show up in our life. And when we can be faithful to that, and we can know these things on a human knowledge level. These things are not hidden from us. Magazine tests can start to reveal these things to us, folks. It's not that great mystery. We can start to conform some of our decisions to being obedient and saying yes to those God-given charisms. Okay. The fourth thing I want you to consider are your talents. Okay, so charisms and talents, I have some distinctions between them, but they are complementary. They do interact a little bit. Okay, what is a talent? Let's define a talent. Okay. A talent, and I'm drawing from a book called Living in Your Strengths, based on some social science data from the Gallup-Clifton Strengths Finder, all right? Millions and millions and millions of people have gone through this sort of magazine test to identify where they rank in terms of these top 34 talents that Clifton Strengths offers. I'm actually going to be getting a certification, and I love this stuff. It's really a powerful tool I'm finding. Well, a talent, if we just consider a talent not like juggling or, balancing, plates on your hands or something like that, but rather a habitual way that we think, feel, and act that produces some sort of result in our life. So we all have habitual ways of thinking, feeling, and acting these habits and that produce some sort of results, right? And habitual ways, mind you, of thinking, feeling, acting that are inclined towards the good, we call those virtues, and inclined towards the evil, we call those vices, okay? So these talents can be virtues that can be grown or expanded upon. But I want to kind of like take the virtuous language out of this for a second here, and just focus on some of these talents, these raw talents. These raw talents are things that we can actually invest resources into, like knowledge and skills, to expand into a strength. So we look at our areas of talent. Say if you have a talent of being very empathetic with somebody, a talent of empathy could be that you just have this habitual way of experiencing the emotional life of somebody else. This can be very helpful if you're in a relationship where you're listening to a lot of people and people are sharing a story, or you're an interviewer and you're connecting with people, or you're in some sort of pastoral role and you can really enter into somebody else's story in a very deep way that somebody without that talent can they're not necessarily inclined habitually entering into that with that person. Now, how do we grow this talent, this natural inclination of empathy into a greater strength? Well, maybe we might grow in the knowledge of being able to understand kind of the separation of where that person's emotional life ends and ours begins, right? So we don't become that person or get sucked into this. I could see how empathy can go awry is in phenomenons like secondary PTSD, where we have counselors that are actually listening to other people and so empathizing with their stories that they actually experience the trauma and are wounded by the trauma themselves. This isn't a fruit from God. So how can we show it more excellently and grow this raw talent into something that's a greater strength so that it can produce results and be a great contribution to society, okay? Another strength that could be out there could be a strength, say, I know a peer of mine, his strength is strategy, right? Being able to really formulate the way, how to get something done very quickly, and just a snap judgment in their head. Well, he just recently went into a course that was multiple thousands of dollars to go through to learn how to sharpen this raw talent that he has of being able to figure out the way forward and actually build some processes and some skills on top of that to be able to even do it in a greater capacity or more efficiently. Okay? So we have these raw inclinations, these talents. When we become aware of those talents, we can start to say, okay, and also aware of those areas that we're not skilled in. we can also start to, I'm getting a little buzzers here. We can also start to identify what type of issue. Okay, oh goodness. Okay. Don't worry about that. We can also start to identify where a decision might be leading us to enter into our natural talents so that we can live in those and expand those, because that's a place where we can really experience a lot of joy in the things that we're doing also. And it almost has a way of magnifying the talents, especially when those talents pair up with our charisms. It has a really magnifying effect as well. We can start to make some decisions as to, okay, is this going to call me into my areas of weakness, or is it going to call me into my areas of talents? And also coming to know those things also allows us to identify where there's some complementary relationships we can enter into. So it's not so much the what do I got to know, but the who knows this skill already, and we can enter now into this beautiful relationship that is, again, fruitful, right? And that's a beautiful thing. When we can enter more deeply into relationships, that's what we're called to. That's something that is certainly nested on the way to beatitude, which is a relationship, living in relationship with Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So the talents, is this decision in front of me going to leverage some of my talents or leverage my weaknesses? Maybe I want to choose to live in my areas of talents because that's where I have my greatest effectiveness, right? And then finally, desire. Desire. Is this decision in front of me going to enable me to experience more of the things that I desire in life? Now, this is where I start to lose people, because oftentimes when we think desire, we think of desire through the lens of original sin and what sin has done in our life. A corrupted, kind of twisted desire. Well, the Catechism also teaches that there's this desire that is of divine origin that inclines us towards the good, true, and the beautiful, inclines us towards beatitude. And yes, we have to consult our desires and where those desires are leading us. Are they leading us to a place of virtue or vice? But when we can start to get in touch with these noble desires, and through repentance and metanoia and prayer and grace, we can start to have these desires oriented towards things that are really true, good, and beautiful. This becomes a really important part of the discernment pie. All right. Do you even have a desire to say yes to this decision, this opportunity that's being presented in front of you? All right. Oftentimes we think, I don't want to do that, is something that we should just dismiss. And I would say that it's not something that you just say, if you don't want to do it, therefore don't do it. I don't think that's it. I think we need to kind of consult the reasons why and come to understand why we don't want to do this. And in fact, maybe if those things are rooted in, an honest desire, or they're rooted in some sort of a vice or a fear, those are good things to discern. But also considering just what you desire, that's a pretty important part of the decision process. I remember I was talking to a friend recently that was considering, possibly a move for the family. And I asked him, I was like, do you even want to move? Do you want to move? And nobody had really asked him that question. And just being able to acknowledge that, yes, this is a desire that I have, and he can start to consult the reasons for that desire and see that they weren't grounded in something that was fear-based. It starts to see that this is something that could be part of that desire that is of divine origin. This could be an interior movement that God has gifted to us, and he's opening us to, not so that we might grasp it or try to figure out how we're going to accomplish this without God, but rather how we might be able to just admit that we have this desire and we are incapable of fulfilling it ourselves. And it's like, Lord, I'm open. I'm open to receiving the way. Show me the way. And we know that the way is heaven, as St. Catherine of Siena talks about, because all along the way is heaven, because Jesus is the way. My little daughter is screaming out there. So I know it's starting to get close to time to wrap up here. But if you have any questions, go ahead, chat them in here. One of the first things to say, questions that people ask is like, okay, well, I don't know what my charisms are. Okay. We don't have to live in confusion as to what our charisms are. There are very simple ways of figuring out what our charisms are. And again, one of them is very simple. Go to Catherine Siena Institute. You can order a $25 pamphlet and have it sent to your house, a little booklet, and you could take a little magazine test, takes about a half hour, and it starts to give you some ideas as to perhaps where God's grace is showing up in your life. And so you can say yes to more of those opportunities and no to the ones that aren't necessarily in your zone of grace. Other thing is like my talents, I don't know them. Again, we help you discover these things at Metanoia Catholic. In our Metanoia Catholic Academy, we've got some programs that we have in there that can help you discover some of these. But also the one that I found is very helpful is that Clifton Strengths Finder, to be able to even just go and get the book, Living Your Strengths, the Strength Finder book. And there's a little code that you can buy when you get the book that you can actually take this test online. And it gives you just some areas of raw strength, some raw abilities, raw habitual ways that you just very naturally think, feel, and act, right? And when you start to know those things, you can start to make decisions on how to grow those things into greater strength so they can make a greater contribution to your family, to your church community, wherever, right? Your mission, your particular mission field. Okay? If there are any other questions, chat them in now. If not, folks, thanks so much for being with us. And the invitation here is joining us in the Academy. All these things that we just went through, we're actually getting ready to expand everything that I did here into like a very big course that's coming up. I'm so excited about this because I really think that when you can start to think along these lines of being obedient to these institutions that God gives to us, marriage, being fathers, even some institutions that we choose to enter, like our noble causes that we support, the places that we volunteer, the businesses that we're a part of, the friendships that we are a part of. These things can really start to shape us as we allow them to. And when we start to know what excellence and start to picture what excellence looks like in those areas of life, and where what our life looks like when we're living in our God-given charisms, or what our life looks like when we're living in our strengths, we're living from desire, and we're constantly allowing God to purify our desires. We can start to really receive this grace-filled image in our mind of what the life of Saint so-and-so, your life as a saint, looks like, and then choose to conform your life to this. That's the invitation. Again, folks, the key to happiness is grace. It's living in the zone of grace. It is living in more of God's very divine life in you. It's what you're created for. It's what I was created for. So we want to help you identify those areas where you can say yes, yes, yes to more of God's grace. Invitation is to join the Academy today. All right, go to CatholicCoaching.com if you want to learn how to join the Mennonite Catholic Academy. In fact, this month we're going to be learning, next month we're going to be learning about beliefs and how we can be more intentional about cultivating a real faith life, one that disposes us to receive more of God's grace. Because again, grace is the key here, but that's going to be a lot of fun. Okay, we'll see you around. God bless.